Refugee twins bullied for their past, but the bullies didn't know their secret training. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of Westfield Academy, its golden light catching on the polished windows of buildings that stood like monuments to privilege and exclusivity. Everything about the campus spoke of wealth and tradition, from the perfectly manicured lawns to the century-old oak trees that lined the main pathway. Students in crisp uniforms moved between classes with an ease that came from never questioning their place in the world, their laughter echoing across the quad as they greeted each other with the casual confidence of those who had never known what it meant to be outsiders. It was into this perfectly ordered world that Amira and Amir Nazari stepped, their worn backpacks slung over shoulders that carried burdens far heavier than textbooks and homework. The 17-year-old twins walked close together, their movements synchronized in the way that only siblings who had faced the worst together could be. Their dark eyes taking in every detail of their new surroundings with a watchfulness that spoke of lessons learned through hardship rather than classrooms. They had been at Westfield for exactly 3 days now, and already they could feel the weight of every stare, the sharp edges of every whisper that followed them through the hallways like persistent shadows. It wasn't just that they were new, though that alone would have been enough to mark them as different in a place where most students had known each other since kindergarten. It wasn't even that they were refugees, though the story of their escape from war-torn Syria had preceded them, twisted and distorted through the gossip mill until it barely resembled the truth. No, what made them truly stand out at Westfield Academy was something far more fundamental. They refused to hide who they were. Despite the stares and whispers, despite the poorly concealed sneers and the carefully orchestrated isolation, Amira and Amir walked with their heads held high, their accents undiminished, their heritage worn not as a burden, but as armor. And in a place like Westfield, where conformity was valued above all else, such defiance was unforgivable. As they made their way toward the science building, Amira could feel the familiar prickle at the back of her neck that told her they were being watched. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Blake Edwards and his followers had made their feelings about the charity cases perfectly clear from the moment the twins had stepped onto Westfield property. "Ignore them," Amir murmured, his voice pitched low enough that only his sister could hear. His English was flawless, despite the accent that clung to the edges of his words, a testament to years of determined practice both before and after their family had fled Syria. "They are nothing," Amira nodded, keeping her eyes fixed ahead. She knew her brother was right. They had survived far worse than a handful of privileged teenagers with too much time and too little empathy. They had escaped a war zone, had spent 2 years in a refugee camp before finally being granted asylum. They had watched their home crumble under the weight of bombs, had learned to sleep through the sound of distant gunfire, had carried their younger brother across the border when his legs had given out from exhaustion. What were a few cruel words compared to that? But still, the weight of those stares pressed against her back like physical things, and she found herself straightening her spine even further, her chin lifting in silent defiance. Behind them, Blake's voice rose above the general chatter of the courtyard, deliberately loud, deliberately cruel. "Hey, look, it's the terrorists! Better check your backpacks, everyone." Laughter rippled through his group of followers, sharp and bright like breaking glass. Amira felt her brother tense beside her, felt the subtle shift in his breathing that told her he was counting silently in his head, using the techniques their uncle had taught them to maintain control even in the face of provocation. Their uncle Karim, their mother's brother, had been a champion martial artist before the war had forced him to flee Syria ahead of them. When they had finally reunited in America, he had resumed their training with an intensity born of everything they had lost. "Never fight unless you must," he had told them again and again, his voice stern but his eyes kind. "But when you must fight, leave no doubt." Neither of the twins broke stride or turned to acknowledge Blake's words, but their pace quickened slightly as they approached the building, eager to reach the relative safety of the classroom where at least the presence of teachers would keep the harassment to whispered comments and meaningful looks rather than outright taunts. They had promised their parents and Uncle Karim that they would not cause trouble, would not give anyone reason to question their place at this prestigious school that had offered them scholarships based on their exceptional academic records. Too much depended on their success here, not just their own futures, but the hopes of their entire family who had sacrificed everything to give them this chance. So they endured the whispers and the stares, focused on their studies, and tried to ignore the growing knot of tension that tightened in their chests with each passing day. They were warriors in their own way, fighting not with fists but with determination, with resilience, with the quiet dignity that had carried them through the darkest moments of their lives. But even warriors had their breaking points, and as the twins slipped into their seats in the back row of the chemistry lab, neither of them could quite shake the feeling that they were moving steadily toward a confrontation that no amount of restraint could prevent. The storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, dark and heavy with promise, and all they could do was brace themselves for the moment when the rain would finally begin to fall. The days at Westfield stretched into weeks, each one bringing fresh challenges as Amira and Amir navigated the treacherous waters of their new reality. They excelled in their classes, their natural intelligence sharpened by years of understanding that education was their best hope for a future beyond the trauma they had experienced. Teachers praised their work ethic, their insightful contributions to class discussions, their unfailing politeness in the face of thinly veiled hostility from classmates. But academic success only seemed to intensify the resentment directed toward them, especially from Blake and his inner circle, who viewed the twins' achievements as somehow threatening to the natural order of things. "It's not fair," they overheard Blake complaining loudly in the cafeteria one afternoon, his voice pitched to carry to where the twins sat isolated at the end of a long table. They probably cheated on the entrance exams. No way these refugees actually earned their way in here. His girlfriend, Madison Parker, leaned against his shoulder with a smirk, twisting her perfectly glossed lips. They probably just got in because the school needed to fill some diversity quota. Makes us look good to have a couple of charity cases around. The words stung, but the twins had developed thick skin out of necessity. They continued eating their lunch, shoulders straight, expressions carefully neutral as they discussed their physics assignment, as if they couldn't hear the cruelty being spewed just a few tables away. What Blake and his friends couldn't understand from their positions of comfort and privilege, was that words alone could never break people who had already survived the unimaginable. The verbal jabs might leave bruises on their hearts, but those bruises would fade alongside all the others they carried, invisible but ever-present reminders of everything they had endured to reach this place of relative safety. If you've made it this far in this incredible story of resilience and courage, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below, sharing where you're watching from, and tell me about a time when you or someone you know showed extraordinary strength in the face of adversity. Your stories inspire this channel to keep bringing powerful content like this to you all. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's video explores how one small act of kindness changed the trajectory of an entire community after a natural disaster. You won't want to miss it. The real trouble began one rainy Tuesday in October, nearly 2 months after the twins had started at Westfield. They had settled into a routine by then, had learned which hallways to avoid between classes, which teachers would intervene when the harassment became too obvious, and which ones would look the other way. They had even made a few cautious friendships. Lily Chen, a quiet girl from their calculus class who had approached them with shy offers of study sessions. Marcus Johnson, the star of the debate team who had recruited Amir after hearing him dismantle another student's flawed argument in history class. And Elena Rodriguez, a scholarship student like themselves who understood what it meant to move between worlds. These small connections had made Westfield more bearable, had given the twins islands of normalcy in the sea of hostility that continued to surround them. But Blake Edwards had noticed these fragile friendships forming, had seen the twins beginning to find their footing, and something about their resilience seemed to infuriate him beyond reason. On that rain-soaked Tuesday, he decided to escalate. The twins were making their way to the library during their free period, discussing in rapid-fire Arabic the essay they needed to complete for their literature class, when Blake and his friends stepped out from an empty classroom, effectively blocking the corridor ahead. "Well, look who it is," Blake drawled, his arms crossed over his chest, his Letterman jacket a badge of the status he wielded like a weapon. "The desert rats are speaking their terrorist language again." Behind him, his friends snickered, spreading out to form a loose semicircle that left no clear path forward. Amir shifted slightly, positioning himself just a half step in front of his sister, his body language casual but his muscles tensing beneath his uniform. When he spoke, his voice was calm, controlled. "We need to get to the library. Please let us pass." Blake's smile widened, his eyes gleaming with malicious delight at finally getting a direct response after weeks of being ignored. "Oh, it speaks English. I was starting to think they'd let you in without even knowing the language. But then, standards have really gone downhill since they started letting in refugees." Amira placed a hand lightly on her brother's arm, a silent reminder of their promise to avoid confrontation. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but years of training had taught her how to keep her breathing steady, how to project a calm she didn't feel. "We just want to pass," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "We don't want any trouble." Madison stepped forward, her perfectly manicured finger jabbing toward Amira's face. "Trouble is all your kind brings. Everyone knows it. You don't belong here, and you never will." The twins had heard variations of this sentiment so many times that it should have lost its power to wound. But something about the absolute conviction in Madison's voice, the casual cruelty with which she dismissed their right to exist in this space, cut through their carefully constructed defenses. Still, they held their ground, neither advancing nor retreating, their faces revealing nothing of the turmoil beneath. Blake, clearly frustrated by their continued composure, decided to push further. He stepped forward, deliberately bumping his shoulder hard against Amir's, causing the slightly smaller boy to stagger back a step. "What's wrong, refugee? Don't have the guts to stand up for yourself? Or maybe you only know how to fight when you've got bombs strapped to your chest?" Something dangerous flashed in Amir's eyes, there and gone so quickly that anyone who wasn't watching closely would have missed it entirely. It was the look of someone who had spent years learning to channel anger into discipline, to transform rage into focused power. His sister recognized it immediately and tightened her grip on his arm, her fingers digging into the fabric of his blazer. "He's not worth it," she whispered in Arabic, her voice barely audible even to her twin. "Remember what Uncle Karim said." The mention of their uncle seemed to center Amir, and the tension in his muscles eased slightly beneath Amira's touch. He took a deliberate step back, creating distance between himself and Blake. "We are late for studying," he said in English, his accent more pronounced due to the effort it took to keep his voice level. "Please let us pass." Blake's face darkened with anger at being so clearly dismissed. He wasn't used to being the one without power in these exchanges, wasn't accustomed to having his provocations met with such composed resistance. He reached out suddenly, grabbing the strap of Amira's backpack and yanking hard enough that she stumbled forward. "Maybe I don't want to let you pass," he sneered, keeping his grip on her bag. "Maybe I think you need to learn some respect for the people whose country you're invading." The hallway went silent, the small crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation holding their collective breath. Even Blake's friends seemed uneasy now, exchanging glances as the situation threatened to spiral beyond the usual verbal harassment into something more serious. And in that moment of tense silence, something shifted in the twins. It wasn't a decision made in anger, wasn't driven by the hurt that had accumulated over weeks of enduring hatred and ignorance. Instead, it was the calm, clear recognition that a line had been crossed. Not just in the physical contact, but in the fundamental denial of their humanity that Blake's words represented. They had been patient, had turned the other cheek, had tried to prove themselves worthy through academic excellence and unfailing politeness. But their dignity was not negotiable, and they would not allow themselves to be physically intimidated, not when they had the skills to prevent it. Without seeming to move at all, Amira was suddenly free of Blake's grasp, her bag still securely on her shoulder as she pivoted away from his reach with a grace that spoke of thousands of hours of practice. Beside her, Amir had shifted his stance slightly, his feet positioned shoulder-width apart, his center of gravity low and stable. To the untrained eye, they appeared relaxed, almost casual. But anyone with knowledge of martial arts would have recognized the potential energy coiled within their seemingly tranquil postures, ready to be released at a moment's notice. "Don't touch my sister again," Amir said, his voice quiet but carrying a note of steel that hadn't been present before. "We don't want to fight, but we will defend ourselves if we must." Blake's eyes widened momentarily, surprised by the sudden change in demeanor from the twins who had until now absorbed every insult without visible reaction. But his shock quickly gave way to renewed anger, his face flushing red, as he registered what he perceived as a challenge to his authority. "Is that a threat?" he demanded, taking a menacing step forward. "Because where I come from, we don't take kindly to being threatened, especially not by people who shouldn't even be in this country." Amira met his gaze steadily, her dark eyes reflecting none of the turmoil she felt inside. "It's not a threat," she said simply. "It's a boundary. There's a difference." She glanced at her watch, then at her brother. "We're going to be late. Let's go." With a synchronicity born of years moving as one, the twins stepped forward, clearly intending to walk around the group rather than through it. It was a deliberate de-escalation, an offering of peace, even in the face of provocation. But Blake, his ego bruised by their continued refusal to cower before him, wasn't ready to let the encounter end so easily. As they moved past, he reached out again, this time grabbing Amir's arm and yanking him back with enough force that the boy's books tumbled from his grasp, scattering across the hallway floor. "We're not done here," Blake growled, his fingers digging into Amir's bicep. What happened next occurred so quickly that the watching students barely had time to register the sequence of movements. One moment Blake was gripping Amir's arm, his face contorted with anger. The next, he was flat on his back on the cold linoleum floor, staring up at the fluorescent lights with an expression of stunned disbelief. Amir stood over him, his posture relaxed but alert, looking for all the world as if he'd done nothing more strenuous than flip a page in a book. The hallway erupted in a chorus of shocked gasps and excited whispers, the crowd pressing forward for a better view of the unprecedented spectacle unfolding before them. Never in the history of Westfield Academy had anyone dared to lay hands on Blake Edwards, whose father's generous donations had funded the new athletic complex and whose family connections reached into the highest levels of local government. Yet here he was, sprawled inglorious on the floor, defeated in the span of a heartbeat by one of the very refugees he had spent weeks tormenting. Madison's shriek of outrage cut through the growing clamor as she rushed to Blake's side, her face a mask of indignation. "What did you do to him, you freak?" she demanded, kneeling beside her boyfriend as he struggled to sit up, his expression vacillating between confusion and humiliation. "He attacked you. Everyone saw it." Amira was already collecting her brother's scattered books, her movements calm and efficient even as her mind raced through the potential consequences of what had just occurred. They had promised not to use their training except in genuine self-defense, had sworn to their uncle that they understood the responsibility that came with the skills he had taught them. Would this incident be viewed as justified protection or as an unprovoked assault? Would it jeopardize their scholarships, their asylum status, everything their family had worked so hard to secure? Before she could complete the thought, one of Blake's friends, a tall, broad-shouldered boy named Tyler, whose permanent scowl had earned him the nickname Stone, moved toward Amir with clear intent. "You're going to regret that," he growled, fists already clenched at his sides. But Amira was there before he could take another step, materializing between him and her brother with a speed that seemed impossible given the distance she'd covered. "Don't," she said simply, the single word carrying more warning than a drawn weapon. Tyler hesitated, something in her stance triggering a primal instinct for self-preservation that overrode his desire for revenge. In that moment of uncertainty, the twins became aware of rapid footsteps approaching from the direction of the faculty offices. Mr. Whitaker, the vice principal, emerged from around the corner, his perpetually harried expression deepening into a frown as he took in the scene before him. Blake, still on the floor, the crowd of excited students, the twins standing calmly amidst the chaos, with expressions that revealed nothing of their inner turmoil. "What is going on here?" he demanded, his gaze sweeping over the assembled students before settling accusingly on Amir and Amira. "Fighting in the hallways. This is completely unacceptable behavior." Madison rose to her feet, her expression transforming instantly from rage to tearful victimhood. "They attacked Blake for no reason, Mr. Whitaker. He was just walking by and they went crazy and threw him on the floor. You know how these people are. They're violent, they're dangerous. They shouldn't even be allowed in this school." The twins exchanged a brief glance, a lifetime of communication passing between them in that momentary connection. They had faced prejudice before, had encountered it in various forms throughout their journey from Syria to America. They were not naive enough to believe that the truth alone would be sufficient to protect them, not when they were up against the entrenched privilege that Blake and his friends represented. But they had been raised to stand in their integrity, to speak honestly even when lies might offer an easier path. Blake grabbed my arm and refused to let go, Amir said calmly, meeting Mr. Whitaker's suspicious gaze without flinching. "I defended myself, using the minimum force necessary to break his hold. We did not want this confrontation. We tried to walk away." Mr. Whitaker's frown deepened, his skepticism evident in every line of his face. "Is this true?" he demanded, looking not at Blake or his friends, but at the surrounding students who had witnessed the entire exchange. There was a moment of tense silence, the crowd shifting uncomfortably under his scrutiny. Then, from the back of the group, a voice spoke up. "It's true, Mr. Whitaker." Lily Chen stepped forward, her slender frame seeming to shrink under the sudden attention, but her voice remained steady. "Blake and his friends blocked the hallway and wouldn't let Amir and Amira pass. They were saying really horrible things to them, calling them terrorists and stuff. And then Blake grabbed Amira's backpack and pulled her, and after that, he grabbed Amir when they tried to leave." Marcus Johnson moved to stand beside Lily, his considerable height making him easy to spot in the crowd. "I saw it too, sir. The twins tried to walk away, but Blake wouldn't let them. What Amir did was self-defense." Elena Rodriguez joined them, her expression resolute despite the tremor in her hands. "Blake's been harassing them since they got here, Mr. Whitaker. We've all seen it. Today he just took it too far." Blake had managed to get to his feet by this point, his face flushed with a combination of pain and humiliation. "They're lying," he sputtered, gesturing wildly at the twins. "These charity cases have been causing problems since day one, and now they're turning everyone against me. My father will hear about this. He'll have them expelled. He'll have them sent back where they came from." Mr. Whitaker raised a hand to silence Blake's tirade, his expression difficult to read. After a moment of consideration, he pointed at the twins and then at Blake and his immediate circle. "All of you, to my office, now! The rest of you get to class immediately." As the crowd reluctantly dispersed, the twins fell into step behind the vice principal, their faces composed, even as uncertainty churned beneath the surface. They had known from the beginning that their position at Westfield was precarious, that they walked a tightrope where one misstep could send them plummeting back into the instability they had fought so hard to escape. But they had also known that there were lines they could not allow others to cross, boundaries they had to defend if they were to maintain the dignity that had carried them through the darkest moments of their lives. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, as they had faced everything else, with courage, with integrity, and with the unshakable bond that had been forged in the fires of war and tempered in the crucible of their shared journey. Seated in the hard plastic chairs outside Mr. Whitaker's office, Amira and Amir maintained their composed exteriors, even as their minds raced through potential outcomes and contingency plans. They had been in enough precarious situations to know that panic served no purpose, that clear thinking was their best asset in moments of crisis. Across the waiting area, Blake and Madison sat huddled together, occasionally shooting venomous glares in the twins' direction while whispering urgently to each other. Blake's father had been called, along with the twins' parents, and the tense silence in the administrative office was punctuated only by the rhythmic tapping of the secretary's keyboard and the muffled sounds of Mr. Whitaker's voice as he spoke on the phone behind his closed door. The twins did not speak, communicating instead through the subtle language of shared glances and slight movements that they had perfected over years of needing to understand each other without words. They knew what was at stake, not just their place at Westfield, but potentially their family's status in the country that had offered them refuge from the violence that had consumed their homeland. The door to the outer office swung open, and their parents entered, their expressions tight with worry. Samir and Layla Nazari had aged beyond their years, the hardships of war and displacement etching deep lines around their eyes and mouths, but they carried themselves with the quiet dignity that they had passed on to their children. Behind them came their uncle Karim, his broad shoulders and martial artist's grace making him an imposing presence despite his average height. The twins rose immediately, respectful as always in the presence of their elders. "Baba, Mama," Amira greeted them softly in Arabic, her composure cracking slightly at the sight of her parents' concern. "Uncle Karim." Their father stepped forward, his weathered hands gently grasping his children's shoulders as his eyes searched their faces for signs of distress. "Are you hurt?" he asked in their native language, his voice low and urgent. Amir shook his head. "We are fine, Baba. There was an incident, but we are not injured." Their mother moved closer, her gaze shifting between her children with the hypervigilance that had become second nature during their years of constant threat. "What happened?" she asked, though something in her eyes suggested she already knew the answer. Before either twin could respond, the door to Mr. Whitaker's office opened, and the vice principal emerged, his expression grave. "Mr. and Mrs. Nazari," he said, acknowledging their presence with a nod. "Thank you for coming so quickly. We have a serious situation to discuss regarding your children." At almost the same moment, the office door opened again, revealing a tall, impeccably dressed man whose confident stride and imperious expression immediately identified him as Blake's father, even before he spoke. "Richard Edwards," he announced, extending his hand to Mr. Whitaker while completely ignoring the Nazari family. "I understand there's been some trouble involving my son. I expect this matter to be resolved swiftly and appropriately." The implication in his tone was clear. Appropriately meant in his favor, with consequences falling solely on the twins rather than on his son. Mr. Whitaker seemed to wilt slightly under Richard Edwards' commanding presence, his already nervous demeanor becoming even more pronounced. "Yes, Mr. Edwards, of course. If you'll all come into my office, we can discuss what happened and determine the appropriate course of action." As they filed into the spacious office, a stark contrast to the cramped waiting area, the division was immediate and obvious. The Edwards family, including Madison, who had attached herself firmly to Blake's side, positioned themselves near Mr. Whitaker's desk, while the Nazari family was left to take the seats furthest from the center of power. It was a physical manifestation of the imbalance that had defined the twins' experience at Westfield from the beginning. Two refugee students against the full weight of generational wealth and privilege. Mr. Whitaker cleared his throat, folding his hands on his desk as he addressed the assembled parents. "I've called you all here because there was a physical altercation between Amir and Blake in the hallway outside the library approximately 1 hour ago. According to multiple accounts, Amir used some form of martial arts technique to throw Blake to the floor, resulting in potential injuries that we're still assessing." Richard Edwards' face darkened with anger, his hand coming down hard on Mr. Whitaker's desk. "This is outrageous. My son was attacked by this refugee, and you're talking about assessing the situation. He should be expelled immediately. In fact, I'm considering pressing charges for assault. This kind of violent behavior cannot be tolerated in our community." Samir Nazari straightened in his chair, his voice quiet but firm when he spoke. "My son does not engage in violence without provocation. If he defended himself, there must have been a reason." Richard Edwards scoffed, his contempt undisguised. "Of course you would defend him, but the facts are clear. Your son attacked mine, and there must be consequences." Uncle Karim, who had remained silent until this point, leaned forward slightly, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Edwards' aggressive posturing. "Perhaps we should hear from the students themselves," he suggested, his accented English precise and measured. "And from the witnesses who were present. I understand there were many who saw what happened." Mr. Whitaker nodded reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable with the tension filling his office. "We have taken statements from several students who witnessed the incident. The accounts vary somewhat, but there seems to be agreement that Blake and his friends confronted Amir and Amira in the hallway, that there was an exchange of words, and that the situation escalated when Blake grabbed Amir's arm." Richard Edwards waved this summary away dismissively. "Boys will be boys. Whatever words were exchanged hardly justify physical violence. My son has never been in trouble before, while these two," he gestured contemptuously toward the twins, "are from a culture where violence is the norm. It's in their blood." The naked prejudice in his statement hung in the air like poison, but before anyone from the Nazari family could respond, the office door opened again. The school principal, Dr. Eleanor Morrison, stepped into the already crowded space, her expression stern as she surveyed the assembled group. "I apologize for being late," she said, moving to stand behind Mr. Whitaker. "I was reviewing the security footage from the hallway where the incident occurred." A heavy silence fell over the room as the implications of her words sank in. Blake shifted uncomfortably in his chair, exchanging a panicked glance with Madison. Richard Edwards was the first to recover, his voice losing some of its previous confidence. "Security footage? I wasn't aware that the school had installed cameras in that area." Dr. Morrison's expression remained neutral, but there was a steely quality to her gaze as she replied. "We installed a comprehensive security system over the summer, Mr. Edwards, as I believe you're aware, since your company handled the contract." She turned to Mr. Whitaker. "The footage clearly shows Blake and his friends blocking the hallway, making what appears to be provocative comments to Amir and Amira, and then physically grabbing both of them when they attempted to leave the situation. What Amir did was textbook self-defense, using minimal force to break a hold that was being used against him." Richard Edwards' face flushed with anger, but before he could speak, Dr. Morrison continued, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Furthermore, the footage corroborates statements from multiple students indicating that this was not an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of weeks of targeted harassment directed at the Nazari twins since their arrival at Westfield." She turned her attention to Blake, who seemed to shrink under her direct gaze. "Is this true, Mr. Edwards? Have you been systematically harassing your fellow students?" Blake's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words emerged. Beside him, Madison suddenly found her manicure intensely interesting, her earlier bravado evaporating in the face of irrefutable evidence. Richard Edwards, however, was not so easily silenced. "This is ridiculous," he blustered, though with notably less conviction than before. "My son is the victim here. Whatever happened before is irrelevant. The fact remains that this boy," he jabbed a finger toward Amir, "used physical violence against my son on school property." Dr. Morrison's expression hardened further. "Mr. Edwards, I suggest you watch the security footage before making further accusations. Your son was not the victim in this situation. He was the aggressor, and the evidence of that is clear and incontrovertible." She turned to the Nazari family, her tone softening slightly. "That said, Westfield Academy has a strict policy against physical altercations of any kind, regardless of the circumstances. While I understand that Amir was defending himself, we must still address the fact that he used physical force on school grounds." Uncle Karim nodded, his expression thoughtful. "My nephew and niece have been trained in self-defense since they were young children," he explained quietly. "In our homeland, such skills became necessary for survival. But they have also been taught that with such ability comes great responsibility. To use their training only when absolutely necessary and always with restraint. From what you describe, it sounds as though Amir exercised that restraint, using only enough force to free himself from an unwanted hold." Dr. Morrison considered this for a moment before responding. "The footage does suggest significant restraint on Amir's part. The technique he used was clearly designed to break Blake's grip without causing lasting harm, and he made no attempt to continue the confrontation once Blake was on the ground." She fixed Blake with a stern look. Unlike some others involved, who seemed eager to escalate the situation further, Blake's father, sensing that the tide had turned against them, changed tactics. "I think we all need to take a step back here," he said, his tone suddenly conciliatory. "Clearly there have been misunderstandings on all sides. Perhaps we can resolve this without resorting to disciplinary measures that might affect these young people's futures." The calculated shift was transparent to everyone in the room. Having realized that his son was demonstrably in the wrong, Richard Edwards was now attempting to minimize consequences rather than demand them. But Dr. Morrison was not so easily swayed. "I appreciate your concern for the students' futures, Mr. Edwards," she said, her tone polite but unyielding. "Which is why I take incidents of bullying and harassment extremely seriously. Such behavior creates a hostile learning environment and can have lasting negative impacts on those targeted." She turned to the twins, her expression softening slightly. Amira, I want to apologize that you have experienced this treatment at Westfield. It goes against everything our institution claims to stand for, and it represents a failure on the part of our faculty and administration to ensure that all students feel safe and respected." The twins exchanged a surprised glance, unaccustomed to having their experiences validated so publicly, especially by someone in a position of authority. "Thank you, Dr. Morrison." Amira replied softly, her composure intact despite the emotional weight of the moment. "We understand that the actions of a few students do not represent the entire school." Dr. Morrison nodded appreciatively before turning back to Blake and his father, her expression growing stern once more. "As for disciplinary actions, Blake will be suspended for 2 weeks, during which time he will be required to complete a research project on the Syrian refugee crisis and its impact on families like the Nazaris. Upon his return, he will be on probation for the remainder of the academic year, with any further incidents resulting in immediate expulsion." Blake's jaw dropped in shock, while his father puffed up with indignation. "This is completely disproportionate," Richard Edwards protested. "You can't possibly—" Dr. Morrison cut him off with a raised hand. "I can, Mr. Edwards, and I have. The security footage shows your son engaging in behavior that violates at least 6 separate provisions of our Student Conduct Code, including harassment based on national origin, creation of a hostile environment, and physical intimidation. If anything, the consequences could be much more severe. She turned back to the Nazari family. As for Amir, while I understand that his actions were defensive in nature, our zero-tolerance policy regarding physical confrontations does require some response. He will serve detention for 3 days, during which time he will work with our physical education department to develop a workshop on self-defense techniques for interested students, with a focus on de-escalation and minimum necessary force. Uncle Karim nodded approvingly at this creative approach to discipline, recognizing that it transformed what could have been a purely punitive measure into an opportunity for Amir to share his skills in a positive context. Samir and Layla Nazari, who had remained largely silent throughout the meeting, absorbing the rapid English conversations with varying degrees of comprehension, now looked to their children with a mixture of concern and pride. They had not raised their twins to seek confrontation, but neither had they raised them to submit to mistreatment or to hide who they were in the face of prejudice. "We accept this decision," Samir said, his accent thick but his meaning clear, "and we thank you for taking this matter seriously." Richard Edwards, however, was not prepared to concede so easily. "This isn't over," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear as he gathered his things. "The Board of Trustees will hear about this, Eleanor. My family has supported this institution for generations." Dr. Morrison met his gaze evenly, unflinching in the face of his implied threat. "I'm counting on it, Richard. In fact, I plan to bring this incident up at the next board meeting myself, as part of a broader discussion about our responsibility to ensure that all students at Westfield are treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their background." With a final glare that encompassed everyone in the room, Richard Edwards stormed out, Blake and Madison trailing behind him like deflated balloons, their earlier bravado completely evaporated in the face of actual consequences. As the door closed behind them, Dr. Morrison turned back to the Nazari family, her expression softening. "I meant what I said earlier. I'm truly sorry that you've experienced this kind of treatment at our school. Westfield should be a place where students can focus on their education without fear of harassment or discrimination." Amira and Amir nodded their acknowledgement, still somewhat stunned by the unexpected alliance they had found in the school's principal. They had become so accustomed to adults looking the other way, to authority figures pretending not to see the prejudice unfolding before their eyes, that Dr. Morrison's direct confrontation of the issue felt almost unreal, like a dream from which they might suddenly awaken. "Thank you," Layla said, her English halting but sincere as she reached out to grasp Dr. Morrison's hand. "For seeing our children, for hearing them." The walk home that evening was quiet, the family making their way through the autumn-painted streets of their modest neighborhood, with the weight of the day's events settled around their shoulders like an invisible cloak. The twins' younger brother, Tariq, had been left in the care of a neighbor during the emergency meeting at school, and now raced out to meet them as they approached their small rented house, his 9-year-old face bright with curiosity. "What happened? Did you get in trouble? Did you really flip that mean boy over your shoulder like in practice?" he demanded, bouncing alongside Amir with the boundless energy that had somehow survived all the trauma their family had endured. Amir ruffled his brother's hair affectionately, a small smile breaking through the seriousness that had dominated his expression since the incident. "Not over my shoulder," he corrected gently, "just a simple wrist lock and redirection of momentum. Uncle Karim would be very disappointed if I had used more force than necessary." Uncle Karim, walking behind them, gave a soft chuckle. "Not disappointed," he amended, "but I am pleased to hear that you remembered your training so well. The purpose of what I teach is not to dominate others, but to protect yourself and those you love while causing as little harm as possible." Once inside the modest home that had become their sanctuary over the past 18 months, the family gathered around the small kitchen table, its surface scarred with the marks of previous tenants, but scrubbed meticulously clean by Layla, who had transformed the rental into a place of warmth and comfort despite their limited resources. As Tariq was sent to his room to complete his homework, the adults and the twins settled into a more serious discussion about the implications of the day's events. "Will this affect our status?" Amira asked directly, giving voice to the fear that had been simmering beneath the surface since the moment Amir had been forced to defend himself. It was the question that always hovered at the edges of their consciousness. Would this be the mistake, the misstep, that would send them tumbling back into the uncertainty from which they had so narrowly escaped? Samir's weathered face creased with concern, but his voice remained steady when he answered, "No, Habibti. This was clearly self-defense, and the school's security cameras proved it. There will be no legal complications from this incident." He reached across the table to cover his daughter's hand with his own. "You and your brother have done nothing wrong. You tried to walk away, just as we have taught you. When that became impossible, you defended yourselves with restraint and dignity. I am proud of you both." Layla nodded in agreement, though the worry never fully left her eyes. She had become an expert at living with fear during the years of war, had learned to function despite the constant knot of anxiety that had taken up permanent residence in her chest from the moment the first bombs had fallen near their neighborhood in Damascus. That fear had changed shape over time, transforming from the immediate terror of violent death to the slower, more insidious dread of an uncertain future in a country where their presence was viewed with suspicion by many. But she had also learned that fear could not be allowed to rule their decisions, could not be permitted to dim the bright potential she saw in her children. "Your father is right," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You have both shown great courage, not just today, but every day since we came to this country. It is not easy to walk into a place where you are not wanted and still hold your head high, still work hard, still treat others with kindness, even when they show you none." Uncle Karim, who had been quietly listening to the exchange, now leaned forward, his expression serious. "But we must also be realistic," he added, his gaze moving between the twins. "What happened today will have consequences beyond what the principal decided. Blake and his friends have been publicly humiliated. Their view of the world, a world in which they are superior and untouchable, has been challenged in a way they cannot ignore. This may make them more cautious, but it may also make them more dangerous." Amir frowned, considering his uncle's words carefully. "You think they will try to retaliate?" Karim spread his hands in a gesture that encompassed the complexity of the situation. "People like Blake and his father are not accustomed to losing, to being held accountable for their actions. When such people are confronted with their own wrongdoing, they often react not with reflection and growth, but with renewed determination to prove their power." He leaned closer, his voice dropping slightly, though there was no one else to hear. "I have seen this pattern many times, both in Syria and here. The bully who is defeated does not simply accept the lesson and change his ways. He nurses his wounded pride and looks for new ways to assert dominance." Amira's expression had grown troubled as she listened, recognizing the truth in her uncle's assessment. "So, what should we do? Continue to avoid them? That hasn't worked so far." Samir shook his head slowly. "Not avoid, no, but be vigilant, be prepared. And most importantly, do not allow yourselves to be isolated. The friends who spoke up for you today, Lily, Marcus, Elena, they showed courage by standing with you when it would have been easier to remain silent. Such allies are precious, especially in a place where you are outnumbered." Layla reached for the teapot, refilling cups with the fragrant mint tea that had become a symbol of continuity for their family, a small tradition carried forward from their old life into the new. "And remember," she added, her voice gentle but her eyes fierce with conviction, "you are not alone here. You have each other, you have us, you have your uncle. Whatever comes next, we will face it together. As we have faced everything else. The twins nodded, drawing comfort from the familiar ritual of family discussion, from the reassuring presence of the adults who had guided them through unimaginable hardships with wisdom and unwavering love. They understood that today's confrontation had shifted something fundamental in their position at Westfield, had altered the delicate balance of power that had previously tilted so heavily against them. What remained to be seen was whether that shift would lead to greater acceptance or to more subtle, insidious forms of rejection. The answer began to reveal itself the very next morning when the twins returned to school, their shoulders straight and their faces composed despite the anxiety that churned beneath their calm exteriors. As they approached the main entrance, they braced themselves for the familiar wall of hostility, the pointed stares and whispered comments that had become the backdrop to their educational experience. But something had changed. The usual group of onlookers was there, watching their approach with undisguised interest. But the quality of attention had shifted subtly. There was curiosity now, mixed with the wariness, and in some faces, something that looked almost like respect. "Yo, Amir!" called a voice from near the doors. It belonged to Jason Martinez, captain of the wrestling team and a student who had previously ignored the twins' existence entirely. "That move yesterday, the way you flipped Blake, that was sick, man. Where'd you learn that stuff?" Amir hesitated, caught off guard by the unexpected acknowledgement. "My uncle," he replied after a moment, his voice cautious. "He was a champion martial artist in Syria before the war. He has been training us since we were children." Jason nodded appreciatively, apparently oblivious to the tension his sudden interest had created. "That's cool. We should talk sometime. I bet you've got some techniques that could help our team." With that, he turned and headed into the building, leaving the twins staring after him in bewilderment. Throughout the day, similar interactions occurred with increasing frequency. Students who had previously looked through them as if they were invisible now nodded in greeting or made tentative attempts at conversation. In the cafeteria, where they had grown accustomed to eating alone at the far end of a table, they found themselves joined by Lily, Marcus, and Eleanor, but also by several other students who seemed eager to be associated with the suddenly interesting newcomers. Amira watched these developments with cautious optimism, but also with a wary awareness of the fickle nature of high school social dynamics. "They're curious now because you showed them something unexpected," she murmured to her brother in Arabic as they made their way to their afternoon classes. "But curiosity is not the same as acceptance." Amir nodded his understanding, his eyes scanning the hallway with the habitual vigilance that had become second nature during their time at Westfield. "And Blake's friends are watching," he replied in the same language, subtly indicating a group of students gathered near the lockers, their expressions dark with resentment as they observed the twins' newfound visibility. They do not like this change. The tension that had been building throughout the day finally erupted after the final bell, as the twins were making their way toward the bus stop that would take them home. They had just reached the edge of the school grounds when they heard rapid footsteps approaching from behind, too deliberate to be casual. Both turned simultaneously, their bodies automatically shifting into the balanced stance their uncle had drilled into them through countless hours of practice. Tyler stood there, his broad frame blocking the sidewalk, with two other members of Blake's inner circle flanking him on either side. His face was flushed with anger, his fists clenched at his sides as he glared at the twins with undisguised hostility. "You think you're real clever, don't you?" he growled, taking a menacing step forward. "Getting Blake suspended, turning everyone against him. But you don't belong here and you never will. This isn't over." Amira held his gaze steadily, her voice calm when she spoke. "We didn't want trouble with Blake, and we don't want trouble with you. Why can't you just leave us alone?" Tyler's laugh was harsh and without humor. "Leave you alone? After what you did? Blake's dad is on the board of trustees. His family practically built this school. And now he's suspended because of you two refugees who shouldn't even be in this country, let alone our school." His voice rose with each word, drawing the attention of other students who were leaving campus. A small crowd beginning to gather at a safe distance, sensing the potential for another confrontation. Amir took a subtle step to position himself more directly between Tyler and his sister, though he knew Amira needed no protection. "The security cameras showed what really happened," he said evenly. "Blake attacked us. We defended ourselves, that's all." Tyler's expression darkened further at the reminder of the irrefutable evidence that had led to his friend's downfall. "Cameras can be edited," he sneered, though the claim was so ridiculous that even he didn't seem fully committed to it. "Everyone knows you two are dangerous. You probably learned all that terrorist fighting stuff, planning to use it against Americans." The naked prejudice in his statement hung in the air like poison. But the twins had heard worse since their arrival in America. From border agents, from suspicious neighbors, from anonymous online commenters who knew nothing about them beyond their status as refugees. They had learned to let such ignorance wash over them without allowing it to penetrate too deeply, to recognize it as a reflection of the speaker's limitations rather than their own worth. "We're not going to fight you, Tyler," Amira said firmly, her hands open at her sides in a deliberate display of non-aggression. "There are cameras here too, and witnesses. Don't make the same mistake Blake did." For a moment, it seemed as though Tyler might ignore the warning, might give in to the anger that clearly burned within him. But then, from the gathering crowd of onlookers, a voice called out, "Leave them alone, Tyler!" It was Elena Rodriguez, her small frame practically vibrating with righteous indignation as she pushed her way to the front of the group. "Haven't you guys done enough? Everyone saw the security footage. Blake was the one who started it, and you know it." Marcus Johnson emerged next, his considerable height making him an imposing presence as he moved to stand near the twins. "She's right, man. It's over. Blake got what he deserved. Let it go before you end up suspended too." Tyler's gaze shifted between the growing number of students aligning themselves with the twins, his expression betraying his uncertainty as he realized that the balance of power had shifted more dramatically than he had anticipated. The unquestioning support he and his friends had always enjoyed from the student body was fracturing, giving way to something more complex and less predictable. "This isn't over," he muttered, but the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. Without another word, he turned and stalked away, his friends hurrying to keep pace as they retreated from the confrontation they had initiated. As the tension dissipated, the crowd began to disperse, many of the students nodding to the twins with newfound respect before continuing on their way. Elena approached, her earlier courage giving way to a shy smile as she addressed them directly. "Are you guys okay?" Amira nodded, offering a small smile in return. "Yes, thanks to you and Marcus. That was brave of you to speak up." Elena shrugged, though her cheeks flushed with pleasure at the acknowledgement. "It wasn't brave, it was just right. What they've been doing to you since you got here." "It's not okay. None of it is okay." Marcus joined them, his expression serious despite the casual tone he adopted. "Tyler's all talk anyway. He only acts tough when Blake's around to back him up. Without his ringleader, he's just a scared kid trying to look tough." His gaze shifted to Amir, curiosity evident in his eyes. "But seriously, where did you learn to fight like that? That move you used on Blake was insane, so fast most people didn't even see what happened." Amir hesitated, years of protective caution making him instinctively wary of sharing personal details. But something had changed, not just in the school's perception of them, but in his own willingness to let others see beyond the careful facade they had maintained since their arrival. "Our Uncle Karim," he explained after a moment, echoing what he had told Jason earlier. "He was a martial arts champion in Syria before the war. He started training us when we were 5 years old, not to fight, but to defend ourselves if necessary. In our country, things became very dangerous very quickly. Our parents wanted to make sure we could protect ourselves and each other if they were not there. The simple explanation contained volumes of unspoken context. The rapid descent of their homeland into violence, the daily terror of living in a war zone, the desperate measures families took to ensure their children's survival in a world where safety could no longer be guaranteed. Elena's eyes had widened with understanding and a deeper empathy than she had shown before. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "I can't even imagine what that must have been like." Marcus nodded his agreement, something shifting in his expression as he fully processed the implications of Amir's words. "That's intense, man. Makes the drama around here seem pretty stupid by comparison." Amira smiled slightly, appreciating his candor. "Every place has its challenges," she replied diplomatically. "Even here, with all this privilege and safety, people struggle with their own battles." She glanced at her watch, then at her brother. "We should go. We'll miss our bus." As they said their goodbyes and continued toward the bus stop, walking now with Eleanor, who apparently shared their route home, Amir found himself reflecting on the strange contradictions of their new life. They had left a country torn apart by violence, had traded the immediate dangers of war for the quieter but no less real perils of prejudice and exclusion. Yet in both worlds, they had discovered the same fundamental truth, that humanity's capacity for cruelty was matched by its capacity for kindness, that for every Blake Edwards there was an Elena Rodriguez, and that survival depended not just on strength, but on the ability to recognize allies among enemies. The bus ride home was filled with conversation, Elena's curious questions drawing out stories they had previously kept locked away, carefully edited versions of their life before and during the war, humorous anecdotes about their adjustment to American culture, descriptions of the martial arts training that had become both a connection to their past and a source of strength in their present. For the first time since arriving at Westfield, they felt something like normal teenagers, sharing experiences and laughter with a peer who saw them as individuals, rather than as representatives of a faceless refugee crisis. When they arrived home that afternoon, the twins found their uncle waiting for them, his expression serious as he beckoned them to join him in the small backyard where they had set up a makeshift training area. Just a few worn mats salvaged from a closing gym and some basic equipment he had gradually acquired through careful saving from his wages as a security guard. "I spoke with your principal today," he informed them as they dropped their backpacks and moved to stand before him with the respectful attention they always showed during training sessions. "She called to discuss the workshop you will be conducting during your detention period, Amir." His stern expression softened into a small smile. "She seems quite impressed with your skills and with the restraint you showed. She has asked if I would be willing to assist with the workshop to ensure that what is taught emphasizes defense rather than aggression." Amira's eyes widened with surprise. "You're going to teach at our school, Uncle Karim?" Karim nodded, his weathered face lighting with quiet pride. "Just for the workshop, Dr. Morrison believes it would benefit many students to learn basic self-defense techniques, particularly those who, like yourselves, might feel vulnerable to bullying or harassment." He looked between them thoughtfully. "She also mentioned that there has been some interest in starting a formal martial arts club at Westfield, if a qualified instructor could be found." The implications of this development were not lost on the twins. What had begun as a disciplinary measure was transforming into an opportunity, not just for Amir, but potentially for their uncle as well, whose considerable skills had found limited employment opportunities in America due to licensing requirements and the language barrier. "That's wonderful, Uncle," Amir said sincerely, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "But what about Blake and his friends? Won't this just give them another reason to target us?" Karim's expression grew serious once more. "Perhaps. But consider this. What has isolated you at Westfield is not just prejudice, but fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of difference. By sharing this aspect of your heritage, by teaching others the discipline and control that has helped you navigate difficult circumstances, You create understanding where there was none before. And understanding is the first step toward acceptance. The twins exchanged a thoughtful glance, absorbing their uncle's wisdom as they had so many times before. There was truth in his words, a path forward that offered more hope than continued isolation and defensive withdrawal. Still, years of caution could not be overcome in a single moment of insight. "What if it doesn't work?" Amira asked quietly, giving voice to the fear that lingered beneath the surface of their cautious optimism. "What if sharing more of ourselves just gives them new weapons to use against us?" Karim nodded, acknowledging the legitimacy of her concern. "That is always a risk when we make ourselves vulnerable," he conceded. "But consider the alternative. To continue as you have been, separate and guarded, waiting for the next attack without ever reaching for connection. Is that truly living or merely surviving?" He moved to the center of the training mat, gesturing for them to join him. "In martial arts, we learn that balance is found not in rigid resistance, but in fluidity and adaptation. The same principle applies to life. You cannot control how others will respond to you, but you can control how you meet their response, how you maintain your center, even as circumstances shift around you." As they took their positions on the mat, falling into the familiar routine of warm-up exercises that had become a cornerstone of their daily lives, the twins reflected on their uncle's guidance. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with potential pitfalls and unexpected challenges. But for the first time since they had entered Westfield Academy, they could see a possibility beyond mere endurance, a chance to transform their experience from one of isolated survival to something richer and more authentic, where their differences might become a source of strength rather than a target for hostility. The following week unfolded with a series of subtle but significant shifts in the twins' experience at Westfield. Word of the upcoming self-defense workshop had spread throughout the student body, generating a buzz of interest that further elevated the twins' visibility within the school community. Dr. Morrison had announced the initiative during a morning assembly, framing it as part of a broader effort to promote student safety and empowerment, rather than as a punitive measure for Amir. The deliberate recontextualization was not lost on the twins, who recognized in the principal a surprisingly astute ally, navigating the complex politics of school administration with diplomatic skill. On the day of the first workshop, Amir arrived at the school gymnasium with Uncle Karim, both dressed in the traditional gi that they wore for training, the white cotton fabric a stark contrast to the usual Westfield uniforms. They had expected perhaps a handful of curious students to show up for the voluntary session, but instead found nearly 40 teenagers already gathered on the mats that had been laid out across the basketball court, with more trickling in as the designated start time approached. Among them were familiar faces: Lily, Marcus, and Elena, of course, but also Jason from the wrestling team, several members of the debate club, and a scattering of students from across Westfield's social spectrum. Notably absent were Blake's friends, though this came as no surprise to either Amir or his uncle. Dr. Morrison stood at the edge of the group, her presence both an endorsement of the program and a subtle reminder of the school's authority, ensuring that what had begun as a disciplinary measure would be treated with appropriate seriousness by all participants. "I didn't expect so many people," Amir murmured to his uncle in Arabic as they surveyed the gathered students. Karim smiled slightly, his posture relaxed but commanding as he prepared to address the group. "People are drawn to authenticity," he replied in the same language. "You have shown them something real, something beyond the shallow pretenses that dominate their daily interactions. That creates curiosity, and curiosity is the beginning of learning." Switching to English, he stepped forward to introduce himself, his accent pronounced, but his words clear and carefully chosen. "Good afternoon. I am Karim Nazari. Before the war in Syria, I was a champion in traditional martial arts and an instructor in Damascus. Today, my nephew Amir and I will begin teaching you basic principles of self-defense, not to harm others, but to protect yourself and those you care about from harm." He paused, his gaze moving deliberately across the assembled students. "The first and most important principle is this: true strength lies not in domination, but in control. Control of your body, control of your reactions, control of your fear. We will start with this foundation." What followed was a carefully structured session that combined physical techniques with philosophical context, Karim demonstrating basic stances and movements while explaining the underlying principles that gave them meaning. Amir moved among the students, offering gentle corrections and encouragement as they attempted to mimic the forms being shown. There was awkwardness at first, nervous laughter and self-conscious glances, as teenagers accustomed to projecting constant confidence found themselves struggling with unfamiliar movements. But gradually, under Karim's patient guidance, the atmosphere shifted toward focused concentration, the students' initial discomfort giving way to genuine engagement with the material being presented. By the end of the session, as the students filed out of the gymnasium with promises to return for the next workshop, Amir found himself surrounded by classmates eager to continue the conversation, to ask questions about specific techniques, or to express appreciation for what they had learned. The contrast with his previous isolation was so stark that it felt almost disorienting, this sudden shift from invisibility to the center of positive attention. Across the gym, he could see his uncle deep in conversation with Dr. Morrison, both of them gesturing with the animation that suggested a productive exchange of ideas. The scene represented a transformation that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. His family's cultural heritage, so often treated as a liability to be minimized, had become instead a source of connection and respect. Later that evening, as the twins recounted the day's events to their parents over dinner, Samir and Layla exchanged glances of cautious optimism. "It is good that they are seeing you for who you truly are," Layla said, passing a plate of fragrant rice and vegetables to her youngest son. "Not just as refugees, not just as foreigners, but as young people with skills and knowledge worth sharing." Samir nodded in agreement, though his expression remained thoughtful. "But remember," he cautioned, "one positive experience does not erase all challenges. There will still be difficult days ahead, people who cannot or will not see beyond their prejudices." The twins nodded, well aware of the truth in their father's warning. Blake would return from suspension eventually, and while the social dynamics at Westfield had begun to shift, they harbored no illusions that their path forward would be entirely smooth. The next 2 weeks passed with a rhythm that felt almost normal. Classes, homework, training, and the increasingly popular self-defense workshops that had expanded from Amir's initial detention assignment into a regular after-school activity. Attendance had grown with each session, and even some of the faculty had begun to participate, drawn by Karim's emphasis on mindfulness and discipline as much as by the physical techniques he taught. Amira, though not officially part of the disciplinary arrangement, had joined as an assistant instructor, her natural grace and patience making her an effective teacher for the female students who sometimes felt uncomfortable partnering with the boys for certain exercises. The workshops had also given the twins a new context in which to develop friendships beyond the initial circle that had formed around them after the confrontation with Blake. Students who might never have approached them in academic or social settings found it easier to initiate conversation within the structured environment of training, where shared physical effort created a kind of camaraderie that transcended the usual social barriers. It was during the final workshop of Amir's detention period that Blake Edwards made his return to Westfield Academy. He entered the gymnasium quietly, almost hesitantly, standing at the back of the room, while Karim demonstrated a technique for breaking a wrist grab. Ironically, a variation of the very move Amir had used during their confrontation. The twins noticed his presence immediately, their heightened awareness of potential threats, making them sensitive to any shift in the room's energy. But neither gave any sign of recognition or concern, maintaining their focus on the lesson at hand with the disciplined concentration their uncle had instilled in them from childhood. Dr. Morrison, however, moved subtly to position herself near Blake, her expression neutral but her posture alert, clearly prepared to intervene if necessary. But Blake made no disruptive move, simply watching the demonstration with an unreadable expression, before slipping out again before the session ended. His brief appearance left a ripple of tension in his wake, students exchanging glances and whispers as word of his presence spread through the group. "Do you think he's planning something?" Elena asked anxiously as she helped the twins and a few other students roll up the mats after the session had concluded. "Maybe," Amira acknowledged, her tone matter-of-fact rather than fearful. "But whatever comes, we will handle it." Marcus, who had become a dedicated participant in the workshops despite his initial clumsiness, nodded in agreement. "And you won't be facing it alone this time," he added, his voice carrying the quiet conviction of someone making a promise to himself as much as to others. The confrontation they had been bracing for came the following day, but not in the form they had expected. As the twins entered the cafeteria for lunch, they immediately sensed the charged atmosphere, the subtle shift in energy that told them something significant had occurred or was about to happen. Blake sat at his usual table, surrounded by his friends who seemed to be watching for the twins' reaction, with an anticipation that suggested a trap had been set. But instead of the direct challenge they had prepared themselves to meet, they found something far more insidious waiting for them. Whispers followed them across the room, fragments of conversation reaching their ears as they made their way to their usual spot, where Eleanor and Lily were already seated. They said they weren't even real refugees, lied about everything, probably terrorists, using fake identities. The source of the rumors became clear when they reached the table and found Elena staring at her phone with an expression of dismay. "Someone created an anonymous account," she explained without preamble, turning the screen so they could see what had captured everyone's attention. "They're posting all this stuff about your family, claiming you lied to get asylum, that you have connections to terrorist groups, that your uncle was some kind of militant instead of a martial arts instructor. It's horrible." Lily, her face flushed with indignation, leaned closer. "It started this morning, and it's spreading through all the school groups. Everyone's talking about it." Amira and Amir exchanged a glance, years of facing prejudice having prepared them for this kind of attack, if not its specific form. In some ways, this was more dangerous than the physical confrontation with Blake had been. A shadowy, anonymous assault on their character and history that could not be countered with a single decisive act of self-defense. "May I see?" Amir asked quietly, holding out his hand for Eleanor's phone. The posts were worse than he had expected. Not just vague insinuations, but specific, detailed allegations designed to sound plausible to those who knew nothing about Syria or the refugee vetting process. There were manipulated photos purporting to show their uncle with known extremist groups, falsified documents, claiming to expose inconsistencies in their asylum application, and comments from other anonymous accounts supporting the claims with additional fabricated details. It was a sophisticated smear campaign, far beyond what a high school student could have created without significant adult assistance. And at that realization, Amir understood exactly what had happened. "This is Blake's father," he said, his voice steady despite the anger burning in his chest. "The formatting, the specific allegations, these are the same techniques used in political campaigns. Mr. Edwards owns a consulting firm that specializes in opposition research for candidates. He's using his professional resources to attack teenagers who embarrassed his son." Amira had reached the same conclusion, her analytical mind having pieced together the clues that led inescapably to Richard Edwards as the source of the attack. But while Amir's anger burned hot and bright, Hers had crystallized into something colder and more focused, a determination to counter this threat not with matching fury, but with strategic precision. "We need to speak with Dr. Morrison," she said, already gathering her things. "This goes beyond school bullying. This is defamation, potentially illegal. And unlike Blake's physical intimidation, there's documented evidence." Elena and Lily exchanged worried glances, clearly shaken by the escalation of what had begun as typical high school social dynamics into something much darker. "What can we do to help?" Lily asked, her voice small but resolute. Amira considered the question seriously, recognizing the genuine offer of alliance for the precious resource it was. "Spread the truth," she answered after a moment. "Not by directly arguing with the posts. That just gives them more attention and makes it look like a he said, she said situation. But by continuing to be publicly associated with us, by making it clear through your actions that you know these allegations are false." Marcus, who had joined them partway through the conversation, nodded gravely. "I'm on the school's social media committee," he offered. "I can talk to the faculty advisor about reporting the account for harassment and false information. And my mom's a lawyer. I'll ask her about whether there are legal options for shutting this down." As they moved to implement their impromptu response plan, Blake watched from across the cafeteria, his expression a complex mixture of emotions. There was the expected smugness, the satisfaction of seeing a plan unfold successfully. But beneath it lurked something less triumphant, a flicker of unease, perhaps even guilt, as he witnessed the real-world impact of the weapon his father had deployed on his behalf. The twins had faced prejudice before, had endured both casual and deliberate cruelty since their arrival in America. But this attack struck at something more fundamental than their social standing at Westfield. It threatened the very foundation of safety they had fought so hard to establish, the legal status that protected them from being returned to a country still torn by conflict and personal danger. It was not just malicious, it was potentially life-threatening in its implications. And that reality transformed what might have been merely another painful episode in their adjustment to American life into something they could not simply endure in dignified silence. This would require a different kind of strength, a different kind of fight, one that would test not just their courage, but their faith in the systems and institutions that had granted them refuge in the first place. Dr. Morrison's reaction to the social media campaign was swift and unequivocal. After reviewing the post with the twins in her office, her expression had transformed from concern to cold anger, the kind of righteous indignation that comes from seeing vulnerable people under her protection deliberately targeted. "This is unconscionable," she stated, setting Elena's phone down on her desk with deliberate care that spoke of controlled fury. "And I can assure you, it will not stand unchallenged." She reached for her own phone, her movements precise and determined. "I'm calling an emergency meeting of the Board of Trustees for this evening. Mr. Edwards may sit on that board, but he is not the only voice, nor the most influential." She looked up at the twins, her gaze softening slightly. "In the meantime, I suggest you go home for the remainder of the day. Not," she added quickly, seeing the flash of resistance in their eyes, "because you have done anything wrong or have anything to hide, but because I want to spare you the immediate fallout while we address this properly. I'll have your assignments sent home and will excuse your absences." The twins exchanged a glance, silently debating whether retreat was the right strategy in this moment. On one hand, they had promised themselves and each other that they would never again be driven from spaces they had a right to occupy, would never again allow fear or intimidation to dictate their movements. On the other, they recognized the wisdom in Dr. Morrison's suggestion. This was not about hiding, but about choosing the time and terms of their response, about strategic withdrawal rather than capitulation. "What about our parents?" Amira asked, practical concerns rising to the forefront of her mind. "They should be made aware of what's happening, since these accusations could potentially affect their status as well." Dr. Morrison nodded in agreement. I'll call them myself, explain the situation, and assure them that the school is taking this very seriously. And I'll arrange for our IT security team to preserve all evidence of these posts before they can be deleted or altered. Documentation will be crucial if this escalates to legal action, which I strongly suspect it will. She fixed them with a direct gaze that contained both compassion and resolve. I want you to know that Westfield Academy stands with you in this. What is happening is not just an attack on your family, but an assault on the values this institution claims to uphold. Integrity, respect, ethical conduct. I failed you once by not recognizing and addressing the bullying you experienced earlier. I will not fail you again. Her words carried the weight of personal commitment, a promise from someone who clearly viewed her role as an educator as extending far beyond academic instruction into the realm of moral leadership. It was a stance the twins had not expected, particularly given their previous experiences with authority figures who had chosen comfortable neutrality over difficult advocacy. As they gathered their belongings and prepared to leave campus, a quiet knock at Dr. Morrison's door interrupted their conversation. Mr. Whitaker, the vice principal who had initially seemed so ready to accept Blake's version of events over theirs, entered with an expression of genuine concern. I just heard about the social media situation, he said, his usual nervous demeanor replaced by something more resolute. Some of the students brought it to my attention, quite upset about what's being said about Amir and Amira. He turned to the twins, discomfort evident in his posture, but determination in his eyes. I wanted to let you know that I've already contacted the platform administrators about removing the content on the grounds of targeted harassment of minors. And I've spoken with several students who were actively sharing the posts to explain the potential consequences of participating in defamation, both for the school community and for their own futures. This unexpected show of support from a previously ambivalent figure was a welcome surprise, a small but significant indicator that the social ecosystem of Westfield was indeed shifting in ways that could not be easily reversed, even by the considerable influence of the Edwards family. The walk home that afternoon was quiet, both twins lost in their own thoughts as they processed the rapid evolution of their situation. What had begun as typical, if painful, high school social dynamics had escalated into something with potentially life-altering implications, a direct threat to the fragile security they had established in their adopted country. Yet alongside the anxiety this realization provoked was a growing sense of cautious hope, born from the evidence that they were not facing this challenge alone, that allies had emerged not just among their peers, but within the institutional structure they had assumed would remain indifferent to their struggles. "Do you think it will work?" Amir asked as they turned onto their street, breaking the long silence between them. Dr. Morrison confronting the board, standing up to Mr. Edwards. Amira considered the question carefully, weighing her instinctive pessimism against the concrete evidence of support they had witnessed. "I think," she replied slowly, "that it has a better chance than we would have believed possible a few weeks ago. Dr. Morrison has more power at Westfield than we realized, and Mr. Edwards, for all his connections, has made a serious tactical error in using his professional resources for a personal vendetta. That crosses ethical lines that even his allies on the board may not be willing to defend." Their parents and uncle were already waiting when they arrived home, clearly having received Dr. Morrison's call and left their respective workplaces early to address the crisis. The family gathered around the kitchen table, that same scarred surface that had witnessed so many difficult conversations since their arrival in America, as the twins explained in detail what had happened and the response that was already unfolding. Samir listened gravely, his weathered face revealing little of the turmoil that must have been churning beneath his composed exterior. As a former professor of engineering who now worked as a maintenance technician at a local factory, he had experienced firsthand the particular cruelty of status loss that accompanied refugee resettlement. But he had never allowed bitterness to overshadow his determination to rebuild a life of dignity for his family, had never wavered in his belief that education and integrity would eventually overcome prejudice and ignorance. "This, Dr. Morrison," he said, when the twins had finished their account, "she seems like a person of principle. That is rare and valuable, especially in positions of authority." Layla, who had been silent throughout the explanation, her hands twisting a dish towel with increasing agitation, finally spoke. "But what if the board sides with this man? What if they believe these terrible lies about us? Could we lose our asylum status? Could we be sent back?" The fear in her voice was raw and visceral, born from the traumatic memories of their flight from Syria, of the years spent in limbo at the refugee camp, of the arduous vetting process they had endured to gain legal entry to the United States. Uncle Karim reached across the table to grasp his sister's hand, his touch gentle, but his expression fierce with protective determination. "That will not happen," he assured her with a conviction that left no room for doubt. "The accusations are false, and we have documentation to prove it. Our case was reviewed thoroughly before we were granted asylum. These social media posts are not official investigations. They are the desperate tactics of a privileged man who cannot accept that his son faced consequences for his actions." He turned to the twins, his gaze steady and reassuring. "You did nothing wrong. You defended yourselves when physically threatened, using the minimum force necessary. You have excelled academically despite the obstacles placed in your path. You have conducted yourselves with honor in a situation that would have broken many others. Do not allow fear to make you doubt yourselves now." His words carried the weight of someone who had faced his own battles, who had rebuilt his life from the ashes of conflict and displacement, who understood intimately the courage required to stand firm when the world seemed determined to break you down. The family spent the evening in careful preparation, gathering the extensive documentation of their refugee status, reviewing the legal resources available to them through the resettlement agency that had assisted with their case, and developing a strategy for addressing the false accusations should they gain traction beyond the confines of Westfield Academy. It was a sobering process, a stark reminder of the precariousness of their position even after years of establishing themselves in their new country. But it was also, in its way, empowering, a concrete response to the nebulous threat that had been directed against them, a transformation of anxiety into action. The call from Dr. Morrison came shortly after 9 o'clock that evening, the lateness of the hour itself an indication of the urgency with which she had approached the situation. Samir answered, placing the phone on speaker so the entire family could hear. "Mr. Nazari," Dr. Morrison began, her voice carrying the particular weariness that comes from prolonged conflict, but also an unmistakable note of satisfaction. "I wanted to update you and your family on the developments from this evening's emergency board meeting." She paused briefly, as if gathering her thoughts before continuing. "The board has voted unanimously to issue a formal statement condemning the anonymous social media posts targeting your children and your family. Furthermore, they have authorized an independent investigation into the source of these posts, with the findings to be turned over to appropriate authorities if there is evidence of criminal harassment or defamation." The collective release of tension in the kitchen was almost palpable, a wave of relief washing over the family as they absorbed the unexpected good news. But Dr. Morrison wasn't finished. "Additionally," she continued, "Mr. Richard Edwards has been asked to take a leave of absence from the board pending the outcome of the investigation, as there is compelling preliminary evidence suggesting his involvement in the creation and distribution of the defamatory content." This revelation elicited a sharp intake of breath from Layla, whose cultural background had given her a deep appreciation for the significance of public reputation. For someone in Richard Edwards' position, such a suspension represented not just a practical constraint, but a profound loss of face within the community he had worked so hard to dominate. "And Blake?" Amira asked quietly, thinking not of revenge, but of the practical question of how they would navigate his presence upon returning to school. Dr. Morrison's tone softened slightly, acknowledging the legitimate concern behind the question. "Blake has been given the option to either transfer to another school or to engage in a restorative justice process that would include direct accountability for his actions and their impact on your family and the broader school community. His parents have not yet made a decision on which path they will pursue." The twins exchanged glances, processing this information and its implications for their daily lives. Neither had sought Blake's removal from Westfield. Their goal had always been simply to exist in that space with the same dignity and opportunity afforded to other students. But they recognized that his continued presence without meaningful change would represent an ongoing source of tension and potential conflict, particularly given the escalation his father had initiated. "Thank you for standing with us," Samir said into the phone, his voice thick with emotion he rarely displayed. "Your actions today have given our children a chance to continue their education without fear. We will not forget this." Dr. Morrison's response carried its own emotional weight, a reminder that behind her professional title was a human being with deeply held convictions. "It's what any educator worth the name should have done," she said simply. "Your children have enriched our school with their presence, their perspective, their resilience. Standing with them isn't just the right thing to do. It's an investment in the kind of community we aspire to be." After a few more minutes of discussion about practical matters for the coming days, the call ended, leaving the Nazari family to process the dramatic turn events had taken. There was relief, certainly, but also a lingering awareness that the underlying issues extended far beyond this specific incident, beyond Blake and his father, beyond even Westfield Academy itself. The prejudice they had encountered was not an isolated phenomenon, but a reflection of broader societal attitudes, a manifestation of fears and misconceptions that could not be dispelled by a single institutional response, however decisive. Yet there was also hope in the realization that they were not facing these challenges alone, that for every person who sought to exclude or demean them, there were others willing to stand beside them, to recognize their humanity, to affirm their right to safety and dignity in their adopted home. The following morning brought another surprise, this one delivered not through official channels, but through the twins' growing network of friends and allies at Westfield. Elena called as they were preparing for school, her voice breathless with excitement. "Have you seen it?" she demanded without preamble. "The petition. Check your email. I sent you the link." The twins huddled around Amir's phone, scrolling through the message Elena had forwarded. It was a student-initiated petition, authored by Marcus and already signed by over 200 Westfield students and several faculty members, expressing solidarity with the Nazari family and condemning the anonymous attacks against them. The text was eloquent in its simplicity. "We, the undersigned members of the Westfield Academy community, reject the false and hateful allegations made against Amir and Amira Nazari and their family. We value their presence among us, recognize their contributions to our school, and stand with them against prejudice in all its forms. We commit to building a community where all members are treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their background or national origin." It was a grassroots response to the crisis, organized not by administrators, but by students who had chosen to take a moral stand independent of adult direction. And it represented something the twins had not dared to hope for during their initial isolation at Westfield, a clear statement that they belonged, that they were seen not as intruders or outsiders, but as valued members of a community willing to mobilize in their defense. Their return to school that day was marked by a subtle but profound shift in atmosphere. The whispers continued, But their content had changed, no longer focused on the scurrilous allegations from the anonymous account, but rather on the decisive response from the board, on Blake's uncertain future, on the groundswell of student support that had materialized seemingly overnight. The twins moved through the hallways with the same dignified composure they had maintained since their arrival, but there was a new lightness to their steps. A quiet confidence born not from the defeat of their adversaries, but from the validation of their own worth by peers and authority figures alike. In the weeks that followed, the immediate crisis faded into the background of daily life as the rhythms of the academic year reasserted themselves. Blake ultimately transferred to a private boarding school several states away, a decision that seemed motivated more by his parents' desire to escape the social consequences of their actions than by genuine concern for his educational or emotional development. The self-defense workshops continued, evolving from an ad hoc disciplinary arrangement into a formal extracurricular program under Uncle Karim's guidance. What had begun as a punishment for Amir had transformed into a sought-after opportunity for Westfield students to learn techniques that emphasized discipline, respect, and personal accountability alongside physical skills. Perhaps most significantly, the twins found themselves gradually integrated into the social fabric of Westfield in ways that would have seemed impossible during those first isolated weeks. They were not universally liked, no teenagers ever are, but they were recognized, acknowledged, included. Their academic excellence earned them spots on competitive teams and in selective programs. Their unique perspectives enriched classroom discussions. Their quiet strength and resilience served as inspiration for classmates facing their own, less dramatic challenges. On a crisp autumn afternoon, nearly 3 months after the confrontation that had catalyzed so much change, Amira stood at the edge of the training mat in the gymnasium, watching as her brother and uncle guided a group of students through a series of increasingly complex movements. Her gaze traveled over the focused faces, the determined postures, the tentative smiles of accomplishment as difficult techniques were mastered through persistent effort. And in that moment, she felt a curious sense of completion, as if a circle that had begun in the desperate chaos of war had somehow closed itself in this peaceful scene of shared learning and mutual respect.